Trigger warning. The following video contains very graphic descriptions of acts of violence and self-harm. If you are young or sensitive to content portraying harm or have recently been through any traumatic experience, it may be best for you to not watch this video.
What's the scariest thing you lived through? Steroid-induced psychosis. I have brain cancer and had to take dexamethasone, and I had a super rare reaction where I went crazy and was having hallucinations which made me think I was trapped in hell. I don't remember most of what took place, but from what I do remember it was absolutely terrifying. This is so much less than what you went through, but a few years ago I had a bad flu and had nightmares for days where I was trapped in essentially H.R. Giger paintings. Just awful machine-like hellscapes, and I was always frantic trying to escape. It felt like my brains was being overclocked too. I had HSV encephalitis-induced psychosis, and it was terrifying for both my family and I. I had the wildest hallucinations, became violent, and they had to heavily sedate me and put me under a ventilator. I would never wish that on anyone. I had a bad reaction to medication changes years ago. Was home alone and in the shower and suddenly thought I was dead and a whole other entity was living inside my body. This entity was telling me I had killed myself and it was my fault they had my body. Wouldn't wish that feeling on anybody. Glad you're okay now, my dude. My dad committed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning and I found him. It was scary in that I didn't know what to do. I couldn't logically process at the time he was already dead, and I thought I could take some measure and save him. Fuck, I'm sorry you have been through all of that. I hope you've been able to access some therapy to process everything. Some people in your position end up with PTSD. Thank you. It was the hardest thing I have lived through, and I find it still something I'm working through. My dad killed himself 14 years ago, still deal with it every day of my life. Important events make it so much harder, like graduation, marriage, etc. Yes, I agree. Everything is a little harder without my dad. Losing anyone is hard, but suicide is that much harder to deal with, I personally think. After being run over by a car, I have had amnesia 3 times. Third time was the scariest moment of my life. You know, you should know who you are, where you are, but there is a solid black wall between you and you. Lasted 4 hours. My father was a drug dealer, alcoholic, and a pedophile. It started on my 6th birthday. I found my voice at 19 when he decided we should have a baby. I told him I would tell the doctor if it happened. He whipped me with his belt until he drew blood and then got in the car and left. He was found by some poor person the next morning in the car after gassing himself. I remember the police driving down our driveway and my mom collapsing when they told us. I was elated. I've done years of therapy and I have a reasonable life, but I'll never be okay. I'm so sorry this happened to you. You deserved better. Thank you. Yes, I did deserve better, but I have a life and I do my best to live it. My girlfriend overdosed. Finding her seizing will probably be a memory I have forever. Edit, she did survive, thankfully. I've dealt with nearly the same thing. We had been arguing and he ran off for a walk, and I waited a little before walking after him and couldn't figure out where he went. Returned home to find he made it home before me and he was passed out hard. Didn't realize he was overdosing for nearly 10 minutes as he appeared to just be sleeping. Shot him with Narcan twice when he stirred and started speaking incoherently and shaking. The call to 911 was one of the most stressful experiences in my life. Trying to rattle out an address, what's happening, and what my fiancé had possibly taken, all while he's gasping for air and turning this sickly pale color and rolling his eyes hard to the back of his head. That was nearly 2 years ago, and he survived the incident and the psychosis that came with the cocktail of experimental drugs he took. Wouldn't wish this sight or experience on anyone. I'm glad to hear she survived, and it's hopefully all in the past for you, aside from some bad memories. I found my grandmother about to fall down the stairs after having a stroke. My grandma had a stroke while babysitting me when I was a kid, and I had to call 911. I recognized the symptoms from the Babysitters Club. One of the characters had a grandma who had a stroke. Luckily, my grandma made a full recovery and is still alive and well almost 20 years later. When a volcano erupted, I was climbing towards it. After roughly 20 minutes and many kilometers of frenzied running. I should have been okay, but I'm from Saskatchewan, and we don't have volcanoes, so I had no idea. Added bonus, I'd had a mastectomy 4 weeks prior and wasn't supposed to do any exercise for another 2. On the lava rocks, I collapsed and ate shit. I just read this and gasped. If I'd had a mastectomy 4 weeks prior, I would have been on my arse with every carb known to man and a cat blanket. You're obviously made of strong stuff. I hope you're doing well now. From a fellow survivor. When it erupted on Westminster, someone just saw that red sky and smoke from distance and called the fire brigade, thinking it was a wildfire. It was lava. After evacuating the island, they started to just cool down the lava with hoses to prevent it from damaging the town, so that people could return after the eruption. The volcano was believed to be dead and permanently safe. I was on a public transit bus to go to high school one morning. I usually walked, but it was so cold that day. So I'm on a bus, alone. It's like 6 a.m. and still dark because of winter. Dude gets on the bus. He could sit anywhere he wanted, he sits right behind me. He grabs my hair and sniffs it with this nasty sounding inhale. Keep in mind I'm 15, and I just hop off the bus and speed walk to my school. He got off and followed me. For this 2 to 3 minutes of walking I kept thinking of what my family would think if I went missing. I got to school safely, but yeah, I still think about that sometimes. I was taught to always sit near the driver when alone. Sadly, I had a driver ask me for my number when I was alone with him. I declined and he made it racial. "Oh, you don't date black guys?" I decided to get off the bus, and I guess he felt bad because he knew my stop was 2 miles away and the walk was all slush. He tried to convince me to stay, but I told him I felt like walking. That's the time we would have wanted Bob Odenkirk to get onto that bus. Oh man, similar experience, but he sat across from me and masturbated. I was 13 and with my friend. Still get anxious riding the bus. I'm sorry that happened to you and your friend. That's so sick. Man, I'm sorry that happened. What a horrible thing to experience as a kid. Did you tell your parents? Yes and no. I was closer with my grandma and told her. She gave me a knife and mace. I told my mom years later. Grandma doesn't fuck around. She really doesn't. The knife wasn't a pocket knife. Pocket knives really are not good self-defense tools unless you are a fast person with long reach and good striking defense fundamentals. She gave me a hunting knife, so I was fairly secure. Some of my parents' arguments. I'd never know when things would get physically violent. The anticipation killed me, not to mention the yelling and screaming. I have a hard time controlling my anger now. And poor communication skills. My mother's mental illness and delusions when I was a kid. I remember one time when she made me and my sister sleep in bed with her because she saw demons hovering around our bedroom window, trying to get in. I woke up to find her staring down at me and my sister with a butcher knife in her hand. She was smiling, but there were tears running down her face. I just closed my eyes and pretended to sleep. Stuff like that, for years of our childhood. When she finally abandoned us, I felt so much guilt at how relieved and happy I felt that she was gone. Man, I'm sorry to hear you guys went through that. I hope you and your sis are doing better now. I'm sure there are also some subreddits and Discord servers where you can talk to people and perhaps talk with others, since I know that talking with people early can leave you vulnerable to judgment. I went through similar shit with both parents, thankfully at different times. My dad has schizoaffective disorder, and like myself, my mom had bipolar disorder. I know how hard it is, and I hope you are doing well now. Also, please don't feel guilty about being relieved about your mother taking off and abandoning you. She did you a huge favor there. Oh my fucking god. The one time I was in a car wreck, just the whole feeling of the forces of the impact, feeling like you are in slow-mo, the glass hitting your face, head hitting the airbag, and mostly the feeling of not being in control. But other than being hit by a truck, made it out okay, only a few cuts from the glass. My parents and I watched out the front windshield as a pickup turned perpendicularly into our lane on the highway, and just stopped. We had no time to really brake or even brace. Coned that sucker, flipping the truck like 3 times. Somehow everyone was okay. I had a black eye from hitting my face on my knee, an older car with waist seatbelts, and some pulled muscles that made it hard to walk for a few days, but somehow everyone made it out fine. The few seconds before impact were definitely filled with terror, but also acceptance that there was nothing that could change what was about to happen. Years later, my brother in his lowered Mazda Miata stopped at a stoplight behind a truck, looks in his rear view and sees an SUV coming at him at 60 miles per hour, the driver not looking forward. Because of how low his car was compared to the SUV and the truck in front of him, he figured there was no way the SUV wasn't going to end up on top of his car, so he figured that was it for him. Somehow his trunk and front end got pancaked, but left him without a scratch. Car accidents are wild. Sounds like his car did exactly what it was designed to do. I have been in a few wrecks. 2 were my fault, and one of those totaled my car. The guilt of being the cause of a wreck stays with me. It wasn't a super bad wreck, but it definitely stays with you. The sound and feeling. After getting a new car, I bumped into someone a few months later. It was nothing bad at all, a little dent in my front bumper. But still traumatizing because of it being a new car. And the stupid feeling of hitting someone literally a few months after my other bad wreck. Anyways, I have nightmares of getting in car wrecks a few times a week. My 2-year-old being diagnosed with cancer. Coming up on the 3rd anniversary of his diagnosis, and he's still fighting, but every once in a while the knowledge of how quickly it could go south hits me in this like wave of fear and panic and helpless desperation. The day he was diagnosed, I took him to his doctor cause he had this black eye that wasn't getting better. She is usually completely unflappable, but that morning she panicked and sent me to the children's hospital immediately. That was the worst car ride of my life, because I knew right then and there that our worst fears were true. Fuck cancer. My father is pedophile and, probably, a sociopath. He molested/raped my older sister who is now dead, in part because of that trauma. In 2004 he and my mom adopted my sister from China and he touched her from at least age 3. My mom finally got the guts to go to the cops in 2008. She had known since the late 90s what was going on but was terrified of my father who repeatedly told her he would kill her and no one else would love her. After he went to prison our lives just fell apart. My mom was addicted to Valium and just wasn't there for us. Edit for clarity, 10 years later it just feels like I was in one of those CSI shows, except the sociopath from the show is your dad. Please be on the lookout in your family and friends. We had the appearance of a normal American family but in reality there was extreme darkness inside. I am like your sister. I was molested and technically raped by my biological father for 2 years, ages 14 to 16. My parents were divorced but I had the fear of not telling anyone because my father was also physically abusive and my stepmother is not quite right in the head. I was afraid she would blame me for breaking up the family and being jealous of her or my half-brother. I do not doubt she did rant like this after it came out. I only said something when it happened to my stepsister. Was still blamed for not coming forward and she was blamed for seducing her mother's husband by her own mother. Nothing came out of it despite both of us pressing charges. Years of CPS visits didn't find it either. We caught on pretty quickly that CPS turns a blind eye to kids in abusive situations when you live in a mansion and grow up upper middle class. Living with my mother would have been just as bad, as I suspect she has BPD and has used me as her emotional crutch and personal therapist for as long as I can remember. Over 20 years later, I still have PTSD and PTSD nightmares. It never goes away. Typhoons in the Philippines. I could see rooftops blown away easily. One almost hit my apartment, but a light pole luckily was in the way to block it. The next morning, a ton of debris were in all walkways of my apartment and we couldn't leave our campus. Water and electricity were out for more than a week. Thank goodness my brother and I had personal lanterns we had brought from America. Giving birth to my daughter who had died in my womb a few hours before. Take all of my hugs, every single one. Thank you. I'm so sorry. Nature is brutal. Thank you. It was years ago, but the death of a child never leaves you whatever the circumstances. I'm so sorry. All grief is hard but I can't imagine carrying a baby to term knowing you won't get to keep them. I hope you found some peace. I went through a school shooting. It doesn't bother me much anymore but I still remember the shots, the screams, and all the kids crying and looking for their siblings, trying to get enough signal to call their parents. People who were so goofy and lighthearted that morning were sobbing on the ground, others just looked numb. I'll never forget the one kid who was an ass to everyone just sat down next to me, held my hand and told me that everything was going to be okay. Holy shit, I'm sorry you went through that, I can't even imagine. I'm glad you're okay. One day my mom called me telling me the cops are surrounding your dad's house. He's outside in cuffs covered in blood. Are stepmom and the kids okay? And I went into a panic. I drove like a madman. My stepmom met me at the home and my siblings were luckily at school. My dad had beat my uncle to a pulp and shot him. He's alive, praise goodness. Crime scene wouldn't clean until we cleaned personal belongings, fridge, deep freeze, etc. So I took it upon myself to help my stepmom. When we walked in the house it was like a horror film, from the kitchen, to the bathroom, to the bloody handprint slid down the door. Some of it wasn't dried after the 8 hours we sat outside. Some things were left behind like a bloody splinted chair leg. I ended up miscarrying the next day. It absolutely ruined me. Worse off, my dad, I feared most of my life, may get off easy on these charges, even as a known felon and repeat offender due to some circumstances. Special needs uncle can't recall the story, and uncle was on meth at the time of attack. Dad was just drunk as usual. Dad spent years saying he'd kill him if he got the chance as he hated how slow he was. I'm so sorry for your loss. That's terrifying. Fell asleep driving through the desert after midnight. Woke up after 2 weeks in a coma, Glasgow coma scale 7, tied down to a hospital bed. The nurse told me that I had tried to get up before. The nurse said that if I fell down, he would be responsible. When I woke from the coma, I was partially paralyzed, and I could not walk, I could barely talk, and I could not use my right arm and right hand. I stayed tied down for another week or two until I was sent to Letterman Army Medical Center. It took a few months until I was able to walk again. Before the accident, I was active duty U.S. Army. I was training for a 20-mile running race, and I was running close to 10 miles per day. I went from being in shape to being unable to walk 20 feet. Luckily I was wearing a seatbelt, and I had an airbag. I was medically retired from the U.S. Army. TLDR, don't drive when you are tired. I had to pin my mother to the ground, getting kicked in the face in the process, and call an ambulance. She had gotten drunk and wanted to kill herself. She's bipolar. When the ambulance arrived, they called the police, because they didn't want to bring in a drunk person without injuries. The police said they couldn't take her with force unless I pressed charges. This was the first time my GF met my mother.